Hello and welcome to section 4, in which we will be creating graphical user interfaces. In this section we will be building GUIs in only a few lines of code very quickly, and then we will be adding widgets, many controls. We will be layering notebooks within our GUI, and towards the end we will make our GUI look pretty. So in this first video we will be building our first graphical user interface. In only 2 lines of Python code we can create a fully functional graphical user interface, a GUI. After doing that, we will add widgets to the GUI, we will configure some default values, we will apply padding around controls to give it more space, and we will then organize our controls within a label frame control, and in the end we create a callback function. In 2 lines of Python code we can create a GUI. Let's do that. We run it, we have a fully functional GUI. It comes with a default size, which is 200 by 200, has a title, has an icon in the title bar. We can maximize it, we can resize it, and we can close it. 2 lines of code. So how that works is, first we import the tkinter module. Then in the tkinter module, using dot notation, we call the constructor tk to create a main window, and we can immediately dot together the main loop Windows event. Usually we will do that differently, but we can do it in 2 lines of code. The more typical way of doing it is we import tkinter and alias it as tk. That helps us to reduce code. We can type tk instead of the whole word tkinter. And in this case we also, from tkinter, we import ttk. ttk stands for themed tk. There are some widgets in it that tk by itself does not have, or some widgets that are a little bit more fancy. So a typical tkinter program looks like this. We create the main window at the top after the import statements. Then we write some code, we create some widgets, we do some logic, and then at the bottom we call the main loop, the main Windows event loop, on our created instance of the tkinter window. And whatever we write here in between, nothing will get displayed until the main loop gets called. This is important. So here we create the instance, we write the code, and then we start the main event loop. So we create a ttk label, and the first argument here is the parent. So the GUI here is the parent for the label. The same for the button. The first one is the parent, and the same for the entry. Entry is a 1-line text entry where you typically write in a username, password, things like that. So then some labels and some widgets have a text property. So a label can have a text string, hello label. The button, we can also give it some text. And then we use the grid layout manager to give it a position. So the first one, the label, we position row 0, column 0 within the GUI window. And then we use row 0, row 1 for the button, and column 2, row 0 for the entry. So when we run it, we get this GUI. And as we can see, the size dramatically changed. It's wider and not that tall. And it has our label here to the left in row 0, column 0, has a button next to it in column 1, and has a click me name on it. Doesn't do anything yet, but we'll add that later. And this one is the entry. So as you can see, the window size automatically dynamically adjusts itself to make enough space for the widgets we assign to the GUI. So it tkinter dynamically resizes itself. Our entry widget by default is blank. It doesn't show any text, and it doesn't have the text property, but what it has, it's called text variable. So in order to put in a text into the entry widget, we actually have to give it a text variable, and the typical way of doing that is to create a string var, a tkinter string var. This string was actually a constructor, and when we create this variable, to the value property we assign a string. So here we call it default entry with some spacing to make it look a little bit good. And again, we cannot just put in the string here as we could up here with the other 2 widgets. We have to create this tkinter string var variable to get the string in there. So when we run it, now we have a default value, and we can highlight it, we can type into it, and we can delete it. And then when we run it again, it's back. So typically what that would be used for is you could give a hint to the user what should be typed in here, for example, username or password. So that's the purpose of this default entry. We can give our GUI our own title. We do this by calling the title method on our GUI instance of tkinter. And we can also add some padding around the controls, and we can do that in a loop. So there are several methods available for us, many actually, and one of them is winfo_children. So when we call winfo_children on our GUI instance and save that in the loop in the child temporary variable, we can then use we can loop through the label, the button, the entry all at once, and we can call grid configure and add some X and Y spacing to it, X horizontal, Y vertical. And we could copy and paste pad X, pad Y into every single one of the grid constructions, but we don't have to do that. We can first create our layout, our widgets, and then towards the end we can just create this one loop where we then add some spacing to all of them in this one loop. So when we run it now, as you can see, there's much more space around each of the widgets, each of the controls. So we gave it 10 to each side, X position horizontally, and Y we also did 10 here. We can change that, then the space will become more or less depending how much we put in there. And the rest is the same, but we have our own title now. That's very simple, just one line of code. And yeah, so that's how this works. We can create a TTK label frame, and that's a frame that can have a label. So the label, the text property here will show up in the frame. You'll see in a moment. The GUI is a parent, so here the GUI is the parent of the label frame. But once we created the label frame, the frame becomes a parent for our other widgets. So down here we do frame winfo_children instead of GUI winfo_children, because all of these widgets are now a part of the label frame, and the label frame is in the hierarchy as the child of the GUI of our tkinter window. So when we run it, we can see here, looks very similar, but actually we have this surrounding frame, that thin line here, that surrounds our widgets, and we can give it a description so we can group related functionality together. And this can be very useful once our GUIs get larger. Let's say we have 3 of them, we have 3 label frames, and we want to move around their positioning. So instead of having to move every single entry, we can just change the label frame, the parent for all of them. So that's really handy. In order to add some functionality to our button, so when we click it, it actually does something. We use the command property, and we have to pass it a function, and this is usually called a callback function, because only when the button gets clicked will this command, this function be invoked. So when we click the function, what we're doing here, we use the entry we're creating down there, and this works because by the time the button is there displayed and clicked, this entry down here is known for the function up here for the callback. So with callbacks we can do that, we can place it above, and on the entry we call the config method, and here we create a new text variable and give it a different value. So we are updating the entry, our text entry, when we click the button via the button callback command. So when we now run our GUI, it looks the same here, but when we click the button, the entry gets updated. Let's do that again. So it comes with the default entry. You can remove that. When we click the button, the command, this function, the callback gets invoked and executed. In this video, we built our first graphical user interface with Python and tkinter. And we built a fully functional GUI in only 2 lines of code. Then we added widgets to our GUI. After that, we added spacing and configured some properties and some default properties. And towards the end, we created a callback function which gets invoked when we click our button.